Well, in Venezuela itself, the new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, who was formerly Maduro's deputy, has been sworn in as the interim president at the National Assembly in Caracas.
From all political sectors of Venezuela, from all social and economic sectors, let us swear together as one nation to move Venezuela forward.
Here in the House of Commons tonight, the Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper said she's been urging her American counterpart to uphold international law.
In my discussions with Secretary Rubio, I raised the importance of complying with international law, and we will continue to urge all partners to do so at every stage. It is, of course, for the US to set out the legal basis for their actions, and the UN Security Council is discussing Venezuela this afternoon. These issues will continue to be matters for international discussion.
Well, the US president spoke to reporters on Air Force One as he travelled back to Washington, D.C. Here's a taste of what he had to say.
Don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge. The country is a mess. It's been horribly run. The oil is just flowing at a very low level, much lower than, even if it was badly run, it should have more income, more oil than what they're doing. So we're going to have the big oil companies go in. They're going to fix the infrastructure. They're going to invest money. We're not going to invest anything. We're going to just take care of the country. We're going to cherish the country. We're going to take care, more importantly, of the people. Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know if they're going to hold out. But Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it.
Well, let's talk to Joel Rubin, who's a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Good evening to you, Joel.
Hey, Carol, it's great to be with you.
Well, really good to have you with us. A lot of concerns expressed at the United Nations and indeed here in the British House of Commons about whether this US operation to seize and capture Nicolas Maduro and put him before a New York court, whether that was legal. How much concern is there about that there in the United States?
Goodness. Excuse me. There is a tremendous amount of concern about the legality amongst Democrats, certainly. Look, these strikes were not taken with any direct authority, no authorization for the use of military force, no War Powers Act affirmation, and no real congressional notification either. So Democrats are concerned. Republicans are kind of whistling past the graveyard, we'd like to say, and just hoping that this won't go badly, that, the President Trump, I think he's used to doing half measures in this case, bombing and sending in special forces and then getting out. But if this goes longer, and this has all the ingredients of going longer, he's going to need to come to Congress. He's going to need to get authorization. He's going to need to get bipartisan support for a longer term mission. Right now, this is the sort of happy phase, the sugar high moment. It's going to get harder the longer this goes if we don't see immediate results to what he's been calling for in the oil sector in particular.
We heard the American ambassador at the UN echoing the line that was taken by Marco Rubio, saying, look, we're not at war with Venezuela. This is about bringing before a US court somebody who's been trafficking drugs into the country.
Yeah, look, I mean, there is some substantive basis for that point. President Biden as well did not rescind the charges that were filed in 2020, nor did he recognize Maduro as the legitimate president in 2024 after the elections there. So there is some truth to that. But, in the big picture, American military assets were sent into a foreign country to decapitate its leadership and take its leader, capture its leader, and bring them to the United States. So this was a military invasion. This was a military maneuver. There's no way around it. It is, of course, a law enforcement action at the moment. But once we start taking the assets, the oil in particular, we're then getting into territory where we may very well need to have American military support to ensure that those Companies can do the drilling. And then, of course, the big question, this is one that people are watching and asking about right now, which is what about Machado? What about democracy in Venezuela? What about the regime, which is still in place? There's not been a regime change. The vice president is essentially Maduro's right hand. So there are a lot of open questions about where this is actually going, and they have not yet been answered.
Yeah, because Nicolas Maduro is widely seen to have stolen the last election.
Yes.
And the opposition, which was recognized by many governments around the world as the legitimate leaders, there's been no sense from President Trump that he's going to put María Machado in power. And indeed, we know that Marco Rubio has apparently been speaking to Delcy Rodriguez, who was Maduro's deputy. So what do we know about how the Trump administration is working with that interim president?
You know, look, Carol, you're bringing up some really soft, I would say sensitive points for Republican ears right now, which is that Machado, her allies in the country won the election. She got a Nobel Prize for fighting for democracy there. And then the president just the other day essentially undermined her credibility and said, when asked about her role, said, well, nobody in the country really supports her. That's complete bunk. Her team won the election in 2024. There's a lot of support. She doesn't have guns. She doesn't have the ability to enforce her will, but she has public support. And so Republicans, they're really of two minds. And this is where President Trump and Secretary Rubio come from different camps. Secretary Rubio comes from the neoconservative camp that does want regime change, and in the name of democracy is a core objective. President Trump, he wants regime change in this case in the name of mercantilism and imperialism and resources, and they're clashing. And so Rubio has no choice but to follow the commander-in-chief, the president, and this means he has to cut a deal with the existing powers that be, which could very well weaken political support for this maneuver if it's seen as just a land grab or a resource grab and nothing of higher minds, which Americans would like to believe that we really do have idealistic goals at heart when we engage internationally.
Yeah, because President Trump has been talking very openly about Venezuela's oil resources, which of course are huge.
Yes.
And there had been US investment in the oil industry, which was then nationalized some over 20 years ago. But is there any justification for the US somehow getting its hands on Venezuela's oil?
Yeah, the Chavez regime took that oil in the late 90s and into 2007, really, and under Maduro, they held on to the oil assets. An American company, Chevron, was still producing, still had an agreement with the Maduro government, and was still getting waivers from sanctions by the United States to continue operating there. But no, it's not our oil. It's Venezuela's oil. It's the Venezuelan people's oil. And so for American companies to go there certainly could be some reclamations. There were lawsuits in court about assets that were nationalized, and they sought damages, and that certainly should be compensated for. But ultimately, these are the resources of the people of Venezuela. And the key question is, how will those be utilized, those resources? American companies do have a reputation in Venezuela, I have to say, of having done a good job in the past of building an oil infrastructure. And this infrastructure is degraded, decaying, and dilapidated. It's going to take a lot to restart it. But that doesn't mean that all the money comes to our companies and to us. It's going to have to go to Venezuela. And does that mean then we're going to start allowing billions of dollars to flow back in to this regime? And that's not desirable. And so these are key questions that are going to need to be answered in the near term.
And we've had President Trump talking to reporters, hinting that he could take military action against Colombia, perhaps against Cuba. He said that the US needs Greenland for its security. Mm-hmm. Greenland is part of Denmark, which is a NATO country. Do you think that, it's a very difficult question to answer, I know, but do you think that President Trump is serious. I mean, he took many international leaders by surprise, despite the build-up around Venezuela when he actually went in and seized its president. Do you think he could be serious about those threats to take action against not just other Latin American countries, but perhaps to try to seize Greenland?
Well, Carol, I think it's very important for your listeners to understand that a national security strategy was published by the White House several weeks ago. And in it, it was very radical in its design when compared to the last multiple decades in the United States foreign policy, which is it essentially argued that we should return back to spheres of influence where the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, where Russia essentially gets to dominate in Europe, and by de facto, by extension, China in Asia. It's very simplistic laying it out. And what that means then is that when you talk Colombia or Cuba or Panama or Mexico, Canada, list goes on and on, those are all within the realm of our right. A doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine from 2 centuries ago, which was known as a doctrine to keep out external powers like China and Russia and have us carry a big stick around the region, essentially. He made a corollary to that, Trump did, in saying he wants that again. Now, Greenland is a little out of our area, our sphere, but it has a lot of resources. And so I don't put anything past this president right now if this is the goal. But I will say, and this is the one thing we have to pay attention to, is the will of the American people to actually go on an expansionist imperialist march. And I think even Trump understands that he can do that sort of, but if Americans get killed in the process, he's not going to have a lot of political support. And that's why we have not seen him jumping with massive forces onto the ground in Venezuela.
Joel Rubin, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carol.
Well, let's get more now on the legality or otherwise of the Trump administration removing Nicolas Maduro from power in Venezuela. On the programme earlier, I spoke to the former Foreign Secretary, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, and asked him if he thought America's actions were legal under international law.
Well, the question of whether it was legal under international law is not for the British government or the American government to reach a conclusion. It's for the courts of law themselves, the international court. The reality, of course, is that there are many countries, both in the West and in Asia and in Africa and elsewhere, who do occasionally find themselves in breach of what the courts decide, but we don't know what their decision will be.
Well, Gordon G. Chang is an American law and lawyer and a China expert. Good evening to you, Gordon.
Good evening, Carol. Happy New Year.
Well, great to have you with us, and a happy 2026 to you too. Do you think what President Trump has done in Venezuela is legal in international law?
I think it's complicated, but I do think that it's legal. Many people today, and especially at the UN Security Council meeting, which was called as an emergency session, we're basically saying this is a violation of international law, the use of force by one member state against another. And that's also the view of the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, as we learned from Rosemary DiCarlo, an Undersecretary General. But this was a law enforcement action. There was an indictment in 2020. We know that Maduro is the head of the cartel of the Suns. Who's one of the world's biggest drug traffickers, and something had to be done. Now, people say that what had to be proper would be an extradition request to Caracas. But obviously, when you have the head of state involved as the head of a cartel, that becomes ridiculous. So something had to be done. And although people may not like the use of an extraction of a head of state, I don't really see what the alternative was in this particular case.
And of course, Maduro himself was deemed to have stolen the election. He was not considered a legitimate leader. Does that make any difference, do you think, in terms of international law?
I think it makes a lot of difference because in the 2024 election, the many Latin American states, the United States, the European Union has said that María Corina Machado won the election, which she clearly did when you look at the forensics of it and what occurred. So yes, that makes Maduro illegitimate, and that bolsters the case of the United States. But ultimately, this is not about regime change. This is not about who won the 2024 election. This was the enforcement of an indictment that goes back to 2020 that looked at his activities as the head of the cartel of the Suns.
Now, we've also got a lot of concern about the precedents that this sets at a time when, certainly here in Europe, many are saying that it gives the green light to countries like Russia. If the US can march in and seize the head of state of another country, why shouldn't Russia do the same? And of course, China, an area that I know you look at carefully, which has its sights on Taiwan. Do you think a country like China will be looking at what's happened here and see this as some sort of precedent?
I think that Beijing would view this as a propaganda opening. And that's the argument that you laid out. You know, why can't Russia grab Ukraine? Why can't China grab Taiwan or parts of Japan or parts of the Philippines? But ultimately, the decision that Beijing will make whether or not to use force will not be based on propaganda points. It'll be based on other things. And right now, I don't think the Chinese believe that they have the ability to launch an invasion of the main island of Taiwan for a lot of reasons, Carol. So although it might be a talking point on Chinese social media, I don't think that it's going to govern Beijing's actions.
And just finally on that, though, I mean, clearly you do think that the case as set out by the American ambassador at the UN, that this was about getting a leader who is accused of narco-terrorism, and presumably they'll have to provide evidence of that. But there is the wider international precedent. I mean, do you think that President Trump is simply ripping up that wider respect for international law, about respecting and not taking action against another sovereign state?
Well, certainly he's undermining it. And we have to look at what's going to happen with regard to Iran, because in a Truth Social posting about 3 or 4 days ago, he threatened the use of force against the Iranian mullahs if they were killing protesters in the streets, which since then, Iran's mullahs have done so. But then again, there's another doctrine called right to protect. And so this gets a little bit muddy. But the point is, if international law is going to protect bad actors and the worst actors in the international system, then there has to be a reassessment of what international law actually means and what the international community should be doing to either enforce it or to break it. Because clearly there are aspects of this that are not good for the general order of the international community.
Gordon G. Chang, American lawyer and China expert. Great to have your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Carol. I really appreciate it.